spirituality and music. This really caught my eye.
Yeah, this is a rich theme.
The sources call music a mostly secular expression of the spiritual. That really reframes how you might think about, well, everyday listening.
It does, and it goes further, suggesting music can act almost like a spiritual technology.
Technology. How so?
Like a tool, maybe? Something you can use for personal growth, for exploration, completely separate from any kind of organized religion. Think of it like a way to focus attention, like meditation almost. It pulls you into the now, quiets down that mental chatter.
The stuff that gets in the way of deeper feelings.
Precisely. So it's not just entertainment, it can actively help with inner development.
And the sources pointed to specific things about music that enable this, right?
Yeah, what stood out was the focus on serendipity and improvisation, especially in jazz.
Okay. The spontaneous element.
Right. The idea is when musicians are really improvising, they hit that flow state, totally absorbed, and that lets them kind of bypass the overthinking, analytical part of the mind.
Makes sense. When you're deep in it, you're not calculating every single note. You're just responding, playing.
It's a kind of surrender to the moment, and that letting go, that release of conscious control, is highlighted as key to the spiritual feeling in music.
Getting out of your own way, basically.
Exactly. Finding that sweet spot between structure and the unexpected.
But the sources also mention that sometimes the style or genre can kind of hide that core spiritual thing.
Yeah, the suggestion is that let's say, the essence is always there, but the specific genre features, or especially lyrics, can sometimes pull your focus to more surface-level stuff.
And then there was the contrast with free jazz, which is in passive listening. It's more like a communion.
Right. It emphasizes the active part, the shared creation between musicians. That itself can be a powerful spiritual connection.
There's that great Little Richard quote you found.
Oh, yeah. Sunday morning to Saturday night and back again, all music is spiritual in its purest state.
That really nails it. It's not just gospel. It's inherent in the music itself.
Absolutely. And related to that, music can pull us away from what the sources called spiritual passivity.
Meaning it makes us engage, not just sit back.
Exactly. It can stir things up, prompt reflection, shift how you feel or see things. The sources even went back to the origins of tonal music.
Oh, what did they say about that?
Well, the idea put forward is that even the early inventors, the ones figuring out tonal systems, their intent was often to create a sense of spirituality or maybe enrichment, wonder, something profound.
So not necessarily religious devotion, but aiming for a deep effect.
Right. Tapping into something deeper inside the listener. It's fascinating.
It really is. And music as speaking in tongues, sometimes without words.
Yeah, that connects back to bypassing the purely rational brain, communicating more directly, emotionally, intuitively. They even mention brain activity changing, neurochemicals linked to pleasure, maybe even transcendence being released.
And here's something practical I picked up on. Music as a shield.
Yes, against negative thoughts.
It's presented as a really quick way to shift your mental state, maybe even faster than visual art, because music happens in time, with rhythm.
The idea is that by drawing you into its flow, letting you shape time by listening or playing, it gives you a break from those negative loops.
And circling back to that spiritual quality being about serendipity, jazz again.
Yeah, the unplanned, the improvised, that's where the spirit shines. And the contrast is music that's maybe too polished, too produced.
Where the analysis overrides the feeling.
Exactly. If control is everything, the spirit can get squeezed out. Now, shifting gears slightly, what about art? Your sources had some really interesting angles on spirituality and art, too.
Yes, this definitely challenged how I thought about spiritual art. It's not just religious paintings, right? The sources say it's broader, even secular stuff like, I don't know, powerful 60s rock music could have a spiritual dimension.
Totally. And what's really compelling is how they downplay the physical object itself.
What do you mean?
Well, the argument is that the record of intent, what the artist felt or remembered during creation, tied to what was happening in the world then, that's actually more important than the finished painting or sculpture.
So the physical thing is just a trace, a conduit for that original impulse.
Kind of, yeah. And there's this lovely idea about art as a spiritual practice being an abnegation of loneliness.
Wow. Abnegation of loneliness.
The act of creating, of bringing something new into being, can be a way to connect beyond yourself, transcend that isolation.
And they talked about resonance, too.
A perfect alignment, they called it, between the spirit of the idea and the spirit of the artist. When that clicks, that's real creative resonance.
Okay.
And building on that, this idea that apical innovations are probably spiritual in nature.
Whoa, okay. That's big. What's the thinking there?
That those really huge shifts, the game changers in history, they often tap into something more than just logic or tech. They have this resonance, this impact that feels almost spiritual.
Makes you think, yeah. And the sources claim you pretty much can't make art without some spiritual element popping up somewhere.
Even in things that seem really technical, like algorithmic art or digital stuff, the example given was like our fondness for early robots.
Robots.
Yeah, that feeling of connection, maybe even endearment we project onto them, that gives them a kind of meaning, a spiritual layer, maybe even if the creators didn't plan it. Thinking about, say, anthropomorphic robots, human-like ones, helps us see that connection we make.
That's a really interesting way to put it. And sometimes the best art isn't even the finished thing.
Right. The thinking about it, the internal process of resolving the idea can be so complete that making the object is almost beside the point.
Could that explain why someone like Da Vinci left works unfinished?
Possibly. They were already complete in spirit, maybe.
Fascinating. And then, the flip side. Once something in art gets codified, repeatable.
It loses that spark, the spontaneity, the discovery that's vital. Once it's just a formula, the spirit drains out.
And, okay, this one surprised me. Quantum mechanics as maybe conceptual art or spiritual practice.
Yeah, that was an intriguing connection.
How does that even link up?
I think it's about how QM challenges our everyday reality, right? It's abstract, mind-bending, kind of like how art pushes boundaries, or how spiritual practice can shift consciousness.
Definitely food for thought there.
Yeah.
But there was also a warning sign, wasn't there? About political activism in art.
Yes, a potential pitfall.
Yeah.
The argument is, if art gets too focused on external issues, political revolt, it might neglect that inner exploration, the personal fulfillment side, which is where the spirituality often lies.
Right, balancing the internal and external.
Yeah.
Okay, let's pivot again. Spirituality and technology, very relevant today.
Yeah, absolutely. And a key idea here is that technology sort of picks up where our bodies and senses end, extends them.
Okay.
But spirituality, the sources propose, begins where technology hits its limits, where those extensions just can't give us the ultimate answers or meet those really deep human needs.
That's a powerful distinction. And what about AI? How does that factor in?
Well, there's a concern raised that as AI gets smarter, it might subtly push us towards more cold mechanical thinking, potentially dampening empathy and emotional depth, things often tied to spirituality.
So we almost need to work harder at our own humanity in the face of AI.
That's one interpretation, yeah. And there was that analogy for AI.
Oh, the electricity one.
Right, it's like electricity always on tap, but doesn't automatically create light, you know? Meaningful output or real insight isn't guaranteed just because the tech exists.
Technology alone isn't fulfillment.
Got it.
And the contrast between the internet and nature.
Yeah, that we might turn to the internet reflexively now, like we used to turn to nature, but that digital space often lacks the nurturing, restorative, maybe spiritual qualities we found in the natural world.
That hits home. Scrolling feels very different from being in a forest.
Doesn't it? And the sources mention the digital suffusion of spirituality today.
Meaning it's just everywhere online now.
Yeah, digital tech shapes how we explore and express these ideas. Online groups, digital art, mediated experiences. It's all intertwined.
And then that really mind-bending question. Spirituality and anthropomorphic robots.
Yeah. What would that even be?
Exactly.
But the sources suggest that just thinking about that question actually helps us clarify what spirituality means for us as humans. By imagining the artificial, we get a clearer sense of our own reality.
Interesting. Okay, let's broaden out again. Some of the other aspects of spirituality that came up, maybe things that didn't fit neatly under music, art, or tech.
Sure. Well, one point was that spiritual can sometimes just mean neutral or agnostic, not tied to any specific belief.
And that connects to the idea of like an agnostic enlightenment through self-actualization.
Exactly. That deep self-knowledge, really understanding yourself, could be a form of spiritual enlightenment. But, and this is crucial, the sources also admit that our whole sense of a fixed self might just be an illusion anyway.
Very nuanced.
Yeah.
And beliefs themselves, they're not static.
Nope. Inherently agnostic, always subtly shifting and evolving, not carved in stone.
And for society, we can't just tech our way out of problems.
That's the argument. Tech innovation isn't enough for deep human flaws. We also need spiritual innovation, a deeper understanding of our inner lives.
Which connects to that interesting point about social media and loneliness.
Right. That constant sharing might feel like connection, but maybe it's just delaying actually facing loneliness.
Yeah.
And that overcoming loneliness itself is a kind of spiritual growth.
That definitely clicks with current conversations about social media's impact. And then the slightly scary link between loneliness and political instability.
Yeah, a sobering thought that dictatorships can sometimes arise when loneliness is widespread and other distractions fail. And secular nations might be more vulnerable if they don't really engage with spirituality and loneliness on a deeper level.
Wow. A reminder that this inner stuff has outer consequences. And there was a simple sign we might be neglecting spirituality.
Just the act of considering the spiritual when you normally wouldn't, that itself might mean you sense something's missing.
That little nudge, that feeling of a gap. And optimism. It's not inherently religious.
No, neither optimism nor pessimism is rooted in religion, according to these sources. But optimism can be a sort of byproduct of cultivating spirituality. Inner reflection can buffer against negativity.
Interesting. And the idea of place.
Yeah, differentiating between real places, physical spots where body, mind, spirit connect with others, and imagined places, which can do something similar, maybe even connecting all imagined spaces somehow.
That our inner worlds can link up.
Beautiful.
And a spiritual path needs faith.
Faith that some things are just hidden by our normal perception of space and time, trusting something beyond the tangible.
And we mentioned guilt earlier. Just thinking about the spiritual can bring that up.
Yeah, again, that sense of maybe missing out on a dimension of existence. But it's not all negative. Our own minds can guide us, right?
Those intuitive blips.
Yeah.
Sudden insights.
Exactly. Moments that lead to epiphanies. And regarding religion itself, there was that analogy.
Oh, the operating system one.
Religions help identify useful human universals. The specifics, rituals, doctrines are like decoration or the interface for the core operating system of spirituality.
And AI might even help identify those universals eventually.
That was the suggestion, yeah. And again, distinguishing surface religion from deep spirituality.
Religion as identity, spirituality is that quiet faith.
Precisely. And whether God physically exists, kind of moot, according to the sources.
What matters is the guiding principle.
Yeah. And that deep down, science, art, spirituality, they might actually overlap or converge.
If you probe deeply enough, and the broadest definition, anything beyond perceptible reality is.
Essentially, spiritual applies to all sentient beings, a very wide net.
Okay, back to music quickly. The paradox of reason.
Right. Music can develop reason, but too much reason, too much analysis can kill the spirit of the music. The best stuff transcends analysis, feels like free spirit.
Which ties into freedom itself being paradoxical.
Yeah, absolute freedom isn't really possible. Breaking boundaries just creates new ones. You need that for definition, for genres. Even attempts at total freedom, like avant-garde jazz, end up making their own rules.
Like the Charles Mingus quote you found.
You have to improvise from something. You can't improvise from nothing. You always need some kind of framework.
And spirituality passing between generations.
The idea that if parents don't nurture their own spiritual side, that lack can echo down the line, and that poignant thought about artists.
That part of a generation's spirit dies with them.
Yeah, a shift in the collective consciousness almost, and spiritual free will. Mentioned, but hard to verify. Maybe a good life doesn't need spirituality, or maybe it's guided by full consciousness. It's complex.
And time. Spiritual time isn't linear.
Right. Our inner experience doesn't always follow a straight line. Like David Lynch films may be truer to consciousness than simple narratives.
Fascinating. And the whimsical idea about animals.
Yeah. If they became spiritual, maybe they'd draw us. Like Neolithic cave art showed worldly and spiritual desires. Makes you think about other kinds of consciousness.
It does. And the caution about brain knowledge versus spiritual practice.
That knowing more about the brain could paradoxically cause more mental issues via suggestion. While spiritual practice teaches acceptance of the unknown, less focus on controlling everything mentally.
Important distinction. And real versus imagined places again.
Both can be spiritually significant spaces for connection. And the idea that artists maybe don't need to invent new spiritual paths.
Because there's so much already there.
Yeah, plenty to draw on. And finally, just touching on cultural views of death and memory.
Like photographing the dead, some see media as keeping the spirit alive. Shows how varied these fundamental beliefs are.
Spirituality is way bigger, more personal than just religion.